How's life going at the moment? Are you feeling happy? Do you have a zest for life? Or maybe you're not feeling so great. We all have a natural inclination towards optimism or pessimism, but often our circumstances are really what drives how we feel. When life is going well, when our work feels rewarding, when our marriage is peaceful, when it feels like God is close, then we're satisfied with what's going on in our life. But when we feel frustrated at work, when we're anxious about our marriage, when we feel distant from God, we can quickly become discouraged. Yet if we believe that God is always faithful, how can we make sense of the hard stuff when we face it? In today's reading in Philippians, Paul models what it looks like to hold on to God's faithfulness when things aren't going well as we might hope. While we interpret our life's events from a me-centered perspective, Paul recognizes that he's part of a much bigger story, and that in that big story, he can see how God is faithful even when he's facing hardships. Paul models this heavenly perspective on earthly suffering because it's important to the believers in Philippi, and it's important for us too. Now, as people who are shaped by an individualistic culture, we interpret the world around us from our personal perspective more than people did in biblical times. The variability of life, the good days and the bad days, leave us open to a constantly seesawing perception of God. One day it seems like he's faithful, and the next day maybe it seems like he's out to get us. But when we take a step back and see our lives from heaven's perspectives, we can see how God is at work in the larger story, and then we can come to a different conclusion. That God works through every situation to bring salvation to his people. And as a result, we can choose to be hopeful no matter how bleak our present situation may seem. So the church at Philippi has heard reports of Paul's difficulties. Several years before, Paul had made a stop in Jerusalem and things appeared to go badly wrong. He was arrested on trumped-up charges and left to rot in prison. To get his case moving, eventually he decided to appeal his case to the emperor in Rome. Now, Paul had had a long ambition to go to Rome, but as a missionary, not as a prisoner. When he's writing this letter, he's living under house arrest in Rome, awaiting his appeal. And so things aren't going as well as he had hoped. And yet, he's not complaining or despairing. Rather, he maintains his faith in God. Read with me in Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 18. Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, more of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. Well, it's true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in my chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. With earthly eyes, most people would conclude that Paul's ministry has gone horribly wrong. But Paul demonstrates an unshakable faith in God's faithfulness in the midst of his trials. After all, Paul realizes it's not about him, his comfort, or his reputation, but about how God's saving message is advancing despite opposition to Jesus' kingdom. First, Paul could see his captivity as a negative, but he looks on it as an opportunity to share the good news with the palace guard. If it weren't for Paul's imprisonment, these people would never have the opportunity to hear about how God's kingdom was inaugurated on earth through the death and resurrection of Jesus the Messiah. Paul's message would seem unusual to Roman ears. Paul, as a prisoner of the Roman emperor, says he's serving a more powerful king. And while he doesn't use the term here, elsewhere in another letter written during this same imprisonment, Ephesians, he calls himself a prisoner of Christ. He's basically telling everyone who will listen that even though he's presently enjoying the hospitality of the Roman justice system, it's not because of the will of Caesar that he's in prison. but rather it is the will of his King, the crucified and risen Messiah, Jesus. No doubt some of the guards who heard Paul scoffed, you're Caesar's prisoner. If your king were more powerful, he'd spring you from jail. Some of the guards might conclude that Paul is just crazy, but perhaps some of them might wonder about what Paul told them. Paul knows it's just his job to plant the seed. It is, after all, God who will bring the increase. God can raise questions in the hearts of Paul's hearers, questions whose answer is Jesus. Paul's job is just to tell what Jesus has done and to live in a way that reinforces the message that he preaches. And that's true for us as well. Sometimes the situations that we face in our life give us opportunity to show and tell new people about Jesus. These people might otherwise not have a Christian witness in their life. Maybe we doubt that those people would be receptive to the gospel message, but remember, that's God's problem. But when we go through difficult times, it changes our perspective when we remember that God can be accomplishing his will through us. So our troubles aren't a sign that God is unfaithful, but they are the outworking of God's faithfulness as he uses us to bring the message of salvation to more people. The second thing that appears to have gone wrong for Paul is that there are Christians who are preaching out of competition to Paul. What this means specifically is a matter of some debate. Perhaps some people are preaching the good news, but bad-mouthing Paul. Oh, well, if Paul were pleasing to God, he wouldn't be in prison. Maybe Paul had built up a network of Christians who were sort of associated with him and looking to him for guidance earlier during his stay in Rome. And maybe these new preachers are trying to lure those people away, take them for their flock. It seems that they're trying to hurt Paul and that their motives are wrong. And we might expect Paul to be defensive and embittered about these people, but he's not. He sees that even if these people aren't wholly motivated by pure motives, the information about Jesus is getting out. For Paul, the spread of the gospel is more important than his reputation, so he's unbothered by what they're doing. People are trying to hurt him, and yet God can use even that to advance his kingdom. By putting God's kingdom ahead of his personal ambition, Paul is able to keep the would-be rival's actions in perspective. We can learn a lesson from Paul. There are times when we might be provoked to jealousy, where we can avoid falling into that trap by prioritizing heaven's priorities. As an example, let's just say that somebody started coming to this church, and we all start to build a friendship with them. And they start to serve in the church in some way, and it's great. And then a pastor from another church invites them to start attending their church. Now, the pastors in town, we try never to do this, and so I don't think that this would actually happen here, but let's just say hypothetically that it did. We could be upset because that person was coming here, but maybe that new church is actually a better fit for them. Maybe the worship style is something that they find more to their liking. Maybe there are connections that are important for them to make in that church. Maybe that encourages other people in their family to start attending church. It might not be in the interest of our congregation to have that person here, but if the kingdom and the person are better served by them leaving the congregation, then we can still rejoice. If we prioritize God's kingdom, we can still see God's faithfulness even in the parting. In the same way, Paul sees God's faithfulness in his challenging circumstances. His imprisonment means the Roman palace guard get to hear about Jesus. And other preachers are preaching out of rivalry, but the message is still spreading. If Paul were looking at his situation with natural eyes, he might drown in self-pity. But because he trusts in God's faithfulness, he's able to detect silver linings in the storm clouds of the trials that he faces. Paul isn't just able to rejoice in his situation, as dire as it seems. He's also able to hope that God will deliver him from it. He understands that this is a season of suffering for him so that he can bear fruit. But eventually, God will deliver him. At the same time, the Christian perspective allows him to see that deliverance could be either by being freed from prison or by dying and going to be with the Lord. Looking ahead at the next section of the text, verses 18b to 26, he says, "Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. What shall I choose? I do not know. I'm torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me. So when Paul says that he knows that what has happened will turn out for his deliverance, we might assume that Paul thinks he's going to be freed. But Paul's view of what deliverance means is more nuanced. If Paul is freed from jail, he can go back to his work of planting churches and nourishing churches, and that counts as a win. If, instead, Paul is condemned for his faith and put to death, he will be following in the footsteps of his Lord Jesus, who was also condemned and put to death. And his death will mean an end to the suffering that his work has often required, and he will finally be able to enter his reward. Paul really wants that reward. But he is also deeply invested in the work that God is doing through him, so he's concluded that he will probably be freed to continue it. Now, we don't actually know for sure how that ended. There are church traditions that say that Paul was successful in his legal appeal, that he was freed and traveled to Spain to plant churches there. But we don't really know. The evidence, though, is quite solid that eventually he was executed during Nero's great persecution between 64 and 67. But whether he was freed for a while prior to this or not, we can know that God delivered him one way or another. If we maintain our hope in God's faithfulness, then we will also maintain our hope in God's deliverance. Sometimes God is faithful to bring us through difficult times. At other times, he is faithful to sustain us in the midst of difficult times. And of course, barring the Lord's return in the next 100 years, every person in this room is going to eventually die. But in all of this, we can recognize God's faithfulness, culminating in our being with him. So Paul demonstrated how we are able to rejoice in hard times. He keeps his suffering in perspective by choosing to focus on the big picture of what God is doing rather than on the difficulties that he's facing. He maintains his hope in God's deliverance by reminding himself that God's faithfulness isn't about getting an easy solution to his problems, but ultimately in allowing Paul to be united with him even after death. Now he moves his emphasis to his listeners. Equipped with this renewed perspective on their hardship, the Philippians can live a life consistent with God who called them. And so Paul concludes this chapter, and this is verses 27 to 30. He says, "Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come to see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in the one Spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed and that you will be saved, and that by God. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him, since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now here I still have." Paul can rejoice in God in any situation because his trust is unshakable. He doesn't despair that God has given up on him, and neither should the Philippians, even if, like Paul, they find themselves in a difficult spot. If they hold on to their hope in good times and in bad times, Paul knows that they will make him proud. What does that hope look like in a practical sense? First, boldness. Second, unity. And finally, hope in suffering. First, boldness. Paul tells them to stand firm without being frightened. The message about Jesus isn't yet formally illegal, though it soon became so. But even so, it was widely reviled by a lot of people. Some people had financial interests bound up in paganism, like the silversmiths who rioted against Paul in Ephesus. Some people scorned the idea that somebody could be raised from the dead, like the people that Paul met at the Areopagus in Athens. The message was often unpopular. But God doesn't save the world by doing what's popular. He saves it by giving us Jesus. Faithfully following God then means speaking truth to an audience that doesn't always want to hear what we have to say. Like when we stand up for the despised or the powerless in our community, or when we model holiness in a world where nothing is considered sacred. For most people, peer pressure or legal threats would be enough to stop them from speaking out. But since the believers in Philippi can trust in God's faithful deliverance, then they can stand up to the authorities that would seek to silence them. Their boldness would be shocking in a world where most people would be cowed by the threat of violence. Now, of course, in Canada today, we're not facing legal sanctions over our beliefs, but we can be cowed or cajoled into accepting our culture's way of viewing things. For example, in our world, war is acceptable in ways that are contrary to Jesus' command to love our enemies. So we must call for peace at times when those around us are calling for war. Or how much of our culture rejects the idea that sex is sacred and should be reserved for marriage. Instead, we hang on to what seems to the people around us as outdated ideas, even facing their derision. Sometimes the pressure that we face is intimidation, but more often than not, it is seduction. For example, we are so saturated with advertising that plays on our dissatisfaction that we may even start to believe the promise, lies, that material abundance will satisfy our spiritual cravings. But the church that is worthy of its calling must be willing to live counterculturally. Jesus calls us to be different. Not different for its own sake, but different in a way that demonstrates in our lives together the upside-down wisdom of a kingdom with a crucified king. Paul knows that the Philippian Christians have been equipped to live this way. He's cheering them on, saying, "You can do it." And he's cheering us on also. So don't timidly follow Jesus, but boldly embrace his cross-shaped counterculture of love. Another important part of our calling is unity. Being unified will help us hang on to hope when things get tough. There's something about suffering that is altered when we go through hard time with people that we love. For the church, their boldness was only possible because they believed that the church had their back. So if someone were arrested, the church could rally around their family to support them. If someone were flogged, they knew that their brothers and sisters in Christ would recognize it was honorable to suffer for the sake of the good news. On our own, we can be easily discouraged. But as a unified family, we can stand up in the face of opposition. This all sounds good, of course, but we must remember that real Christian unity isn't easy. In much of the West, Christians have set up churches of people that look the same as them. Maybe our actions make people who are different from the majority feel unwelcome, so they leave. Or maybe we focus our church growth strategy on a target demographic. But that communicates, of course, that we prioritize certain people over others. But unity in the church requires that we go out of our way to make the church accessible to all. Even though having a diverse church is always going to be more work than having a homogeneous church. Unity is hard work, but it's essential to our witness. After all, Jesus isn't just king of people who look like us. Jesus is king of Jews and Greeks and Italians, Nigerians, Chinese and Filipinos, Peruvians, Egyptians, Kurds, Algonquins, Uzbeks, Tamils, Swedes, and all the rest of the world's people. But churches often segregate and compete. This sets us against one another when Paul tells us that we must strive together as one for the faith of the gospel. It's only when we lay down our own interests to seek the kingdom in which authority is about love and humble service that we live a life worthy of our calling. Then we'll see God's transforming work, and we can rejoice at what he's done in us. The third characteristic of living a life worthy of the call is that we have hope in suffering. I know that no one signs up to be a Christian because they want to suffer, but suffering is an unavoidable part of our lives. And when we trust in Jesus, our suffering is different. In life, we're all going to experience suffering, but an abiding faith in Jesus can temper our experience of suffering. Why? Well, to people in cultures that treat suffering as a sign of God's anger, the Christian faith says, no, Jesus suffered too. So it is not a sign of God's disapproval. To people in cultures that see suffering as pointless and arbitrary, we can understand that God is at work in our suffering, transforming it, even if at our present moment we can't understand how. Just as God used Jesus' suffering to save, so he uses our suffering to save. I'm not saying that I suffer so that your sins can be forgiven, but that God incorporates my suffering into his great plan of redemption. So sometimes I suffer as a consequence of my sin, so that God can show me that the way that I've been going is not a way that leads to life. Sometimes I suffer not because I've done wrong, but so that God can transform me, helping me to learn to trust him in a deeper way. Sometimes I may suffer so that God can transform someone else, as I show God's forgiveness to the one who sins against me, or I show patience in the midst of suffering. Even when the reasons are hidden from me, though, I can trust that God is at work through it. It still hurts, but when we hurt for a reason, it's much more bearable than when we hurt for no reason. If suffering is unavoidable in this world, knowing that it has redemptive possibility is certainly preferable. So it is our trust in God that helps us to stand under the weight of pain that our life will bring our way, even allowing us to rejoice when things are hard. Paul has experienced peace and even joy in suffering, and he knows it's possible for the Philippians as well. So what have we learned? Despite what people often hope for, the life of faith doesn't spare us from difficulty. God is not working to eliminate pain, frustration, or inconvenience from our lives. But as we learn to trust God more deeply, we learn to see our world from heaven's perspective rather than our own limited and self-referential perspective. Then we can find hope, peace, and especially joy when we're experiencing hard times. Paul serves as our role model. He trusts that God is working in the trials that he faces, and he trusts that God will ultimately deliver him. Because he trusts God, he knows that God is at work in the Philippians, believing that they can experience the same joy in hard times. And while we live in different times, the grace is available to us too, if we will only choose to accept it. When things are hard and it hurts, you can find joy even in times of pain, because God's faithfulness means that your hurt isn't for nothing and your deliverance is on the way. So let's challenge ourselves not to see our struggles with human eyes, but learn to see them with heaven's eyes.